really breaking it down and going in depth and discussing things back and forth. I like the pace that we're doing it at. At the Free Your Mind conference, we all only had about an hour, so it's kind of a hurried pace that I had to follow for the presentation there. So that is available on YouTube, on my website, and on the Free Your Mind conference website. So let's get started with the material. And before we do, I'm going to do two things. I'm going to first let everybody be aware of where the images are, who may be listening. The images that we're going to discuss tonight, because there's always visual representations of the ideas covered here on What on Earth is Happening. You could find those on the radio show tab of my website, and then you will see they're listed under the player, images for today's show. And I believe there are 22 images that we're going to be covering today when we discuss the symbolism of the Hypercube, and those are listed there as numerical links, and you click them and a slideshow comes up and you could follow along with the imagery as I discuss it. And secondly, I want to give the call-in number for the show, because I will be taking calls later on. If anyone wants to call in, and there are never any taboo topics here on What on Earth is Happening, feel free to call the toll-free number 866-841-1065. Once again, the call-in number, 866-841-1065. No taboo topics here. There never are. I like to take calls, so we'll get into the material on the Hypercube, and then we'll take a few calls later in the show. Coming up to another break. Don't go anywhere, folks. Should be an interesting show today. You're listening to What on Earth is Happening. I'm your host, Mark Passio. My website, whatonearthishappening.com. Stay with us here on the Oracle Broadcasting Network. Welcome back, everyone. You're listening to What on Earth is Happening. I'm Mark Passio, my website, whatonearthishappening.com. Let's jump right into the topic material for today's show. We're talking about the subversive symbolism of occultism, specifically the very well hidden and subtle symbol of the Hypercube. The Hypercube, if I had to pick one symbol, is the symbol of the dark occult. And I'll be explaining why that is on today's show. Let's look at image number 2 in the series of images that I've posted to the radio show page on What on Earth is Happening. This shows a rendering of the Hypercube. Now, to understand what the Hypercube is, and we're going to get a little bit abstract on this show with the symbols, okay? And you have to have a good visualization capability to look at this symbol and understand what it's saying symbolically. If we look at image number 2, we see that what the Hypercube actually looks like is simply a box within a box, or a cube inside of a larger cube. Okay, so it's a cube within a cube. This is referred to as a 4D cube. Okay, a 4-dimensional cube as opposed to a 3-dimensional cube. If we look at image number 3, this is a very, very simplistic explanation of dimensions, or as they are known in the occult world or the mystical world, densities. So we are said to be living in the third density, or the 3-dimensional realm. If we look at a point or a singularity, meaning there's actually no space It's just a location or a point within space, okay, within some coordinate system. That's considered no dimensional because there's no length, there's no width, there's no depth. It's just a point, so that's 0D. If we extrude that point in any given vector, okay, meaning any given axis of a coordinate system, we now have one dimension. So an extruded point, meaning we have stretched it out along one vector, okay, one direction. That's considered 1D or one-dimensional. We now have measure. Okay, we can measure the length of that line. If we then take the line and extrude it or stretch it out through another dimension of space, we arrive at a plane. Okay? It's depicted here as simply a square, but if we look at the line as occupying all of the space within that 2D square, that's referred to as a plane. It now has two dimensions, length and width. If then we continue this and we take a plane, or in this example a square, and we extrude it, we now have a cube, a simple three-dimensional object. So that's where people's visualization capability generally ends, because we live in a three-dimensional continuum. Our minds basically perceive the three-dimensional world, but since we don't live in a higher dimensional realm, it's very difficult for us to perceive any higher dimensional space, even mathematically or constructually, or in an abstract way. So what a hypercube technically is, from a pure mathematics point of view, is simply an extruded cube. If you took a cube and then moved it so that you moved it in one direction, okay, along a straight line, and basically took the entire substance of the cube through that dimensional space. Okay, so you pulled it into a higher dimension. If you simply look at the bottom right-hand portion of that cube on the far right, the 4D image there that's listed, okay, that is a two-dimensional projection of the hypercube. But if you look at it, if you attempt to look at it in a three-dimensional way, stick with me here, this will make sense. Imagine the 3D object that you're seeing, the cube, okay, the fourth image on this site. So 0D the point, then 1D the line, 2D the square, 3D the cube. Imagine that object in the bottom right-hand side of the 4D object that's listed there. Look at the bottom right, and you could see the same object is there. But just imagine that it has been pulled upward and to the left. So you have another cube just above that. Okay? This is what an extrusion of a three-dimensional body looks like. And again, now we're visually representing this only in two dimensions. And this will become clear in a moment what it actually represents, because we'll have some animations on the site in a couple of images. So look at image number 4, and this makes it a little bit easier to envision the way a website that I found portrayed it. Again, 0 dimensions for the point, 1 dimension for the line, 2 dimensions, you're extruding the line, okay? Then you're extruding the plane to get the cube for the 3rd dimension, and then you're extruding the cube to get the hypercube, which is a simplified rendering of it in part number 4 there, representing 4-dimensional space. Okay? Now, this will become very important when we understand the occultists' view of reality, what their basic overarching worldview is, and how this symbol fits in with that worldview. This is why this is their ultimate symbol. This is why this is a symbol that is only basically, the meaning of which is only taught to higher level initiates within occult orders. Because they're basically telling people through this symbol what they think of the world, everyone in it, and their position in it as well. We'll see that as we proceed. Let's look at image number 5, which is an animated GIF. Okay, this is a simple animated web image that shows that a hypercube is basically a cube that has been rotated through another dimension of space. And if we look at the image, what we see happening in this animated image is that the object continuously expands and collapses in on itself to form what could be considered a vortex or a rotating self-contained box. Now, in the occult,